woods always feel different when night settles in, quieter, heavier, as if the air itself slows down and listens. Cabins tucked deep in those trees tend to hold their own kind of silence, the sort that makes every small sound drift a little farther than it should. Maybe it's the way the wind slides between the branches, or the way the darkness gathers near the windows, but there's always a moment just after dusk when the world outside seems to pause. People go to cabins to escape the noise of their lives, to breathe easier, to sleep more deeply. And for a while, they do, right up until something shifts in that quiet. Because out there, far from streetlights and neighbors, the smallest irregularities take on a different weight. A single porch step creaking when no one's outside, a thin line of light glowing under a door that was closed minutes earlier, the distant snap of a branch that somehow sounds closer each night. These moments don't feel frightening at first, they feel curious, almost subtle enough to dismiss. But in the woods, where the dark stretches endlessly and your nearest help might be miles away, those tiny changes start to gather in the corners of your mind, patient and quiet. And that's where these stories come from. Not from loud crashes or sudden screams, but from ordinary people who noticed something small and didn't realize how wrong it was until it was too late. Tonight, we're stepping into three of those cabins, listening to three real accounts that began with silence and ended with something no one ever expects in a place meant for peace. Let's start with the first one. I booked the cabin because I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere without traffic noise seeping through thin apartment walls or neighbors arguing in the hallway. It sat on the edge of a lake, small enough to feel cozy, but far enough from town that the nights fell into a kind of silence you don't hear in most places anymore. I arrived late in the afternoon when the sky was a pale blue, and the air had that crisp stillness that comes right before evening settles. The cabin looked simple and sturdy, with a wooden porch facing the lake and tall pines surrounding it like a quiet protective ring. Across the water, maybe 100 yards away, stood another cabin, slightly larger, deeper in the tree line, with a single window facing the shoreline. It looked empty, like it hadn't seen visitors in months. By the time I unpacked and settled in, dusk had turned the lake into a dark mirror. I made tea, sat on the porch, and listened to the light ripple of water against the dock. That's when I noticed the light across the lake. A warm, amber glow spilling from the window of the other cabin. It wasn't startling, just unexpected. The listing I'd booked mentioned the shoreline cabins were all vacant in the off-season, which was part of the reason I'd chosen this spot. Yet there it was, a single light, steady and warm, burning as if someone were standing just out of view, reading or cooking or simply existing in that quiet space. I watched it for a while, telling myself a caretaker might have been checking in or maybe another guest had arrived early for the weekend. Still, something about the stillness around that cabin felt unnatural, like the light didn't illuminate anything, it just existed. Later that night, after unpacking and trying to read, I looked out the window again. The light was still on. Same color, same strength, same angle. It didn't flicker even once, which struck me as odd. Most cabins use those older bulbs that hum or dim slightly with power fluctuations, especially in remote areas. But this one stayed perfectly steady. I went to bed telling myself it wasn't my business. Someone staying there wasn't a threat, just a neighbor I didn't expect. But even as I drifted off, I kept thinking about how empty the shoreline had looked earlier, how untouched the path to that cabin had seemed. The next morning, I stepped out to the porch with a cup of coffee, letting the cold air wake me up. Across the lake, the light was still on. It wasn't dimmer, not washed out by daylight, it glowed as though the window itself held its own sun. That struck me even more. No bulb is that noticeable in full sun unless the room inside is completely dark. But the trees behind the cabin allowed slivers of daylight inside. it shouldn't have been that bright. I squinted, trying to see movement inside, but the light washed everything out. I couldn't even tell if there was furniture inside. Just a glowing rectangle set into the side of an otherwise dull building. I shrugged it off again, telling myself it was probably one of those energy-efficient bulbs that never burn out. But throughout the day, no one came out onto the porch of the other cabin. No car appeared in the distant gravel clearing. No sound drifted across the lake, no door, no footsteps, no signs of someone living their day. Just the constant presence of that light. By the third night, I started feeling uneasy. Not outright scared, just tense enough that every time I glanced across the water, I felt my breath catch slightly. It wasn't just the constant glow now, it was the way the light seemed to pulse gently at certain moments, not like a flicker but like someone walking past it, blocking it for half a second. Each time it happened, I looked harder, trying to catch a shadow or the outline of a figure. But the light always returned to its steady glow, and the window stayed empty of anything recognizable. That night, sleep came slowly. I kept waking up to the faint sense that something had changed. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I rose to get a glass of water and felt an urge, soft but persistent, to look out at the lake. The moment I did, my heart dropped a little. The light was still on, but now there was movement, a faint shape packing back and forth inside the window, too soft to fully see, too steady to be a trick of the light. It wasn't chaotic or fast. It moved slowly with the same rhythm as someone thinking deeply or waiting for something. I watched for several minutes, unable to look away. The shape never faced the window, it just paced. I told myself I was exhausted, that shadows can play tricks when you're tired. But the packing continued, slow and deliberate, until a sudden realization hit me. The shape wasn't casting a shadow outward. It didn't distort the glow, it moved through it. The next morning, the light still burned. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was a lamp with a broken switch or a motion-controlled bulb picking up something inside. But when I walked down to the dock after breakfast, I noticed something strange. The surface of the lake near the other cabin's shoreline looked disturbed, not from wind because the trees were still, not from wildlife because the pattern was too contained. It looked like someone had walked into the water recently, not splashing, wadding. A steady, deep footprints leading outward until they disappeared under the surface. I stared at the ripples, feeling a nervous heat climb my neck. By the fourth day, I couldn't take the curiosity anymore. The light burned day and night. The packing continued after dusk. And each morning, the water looked freshly disturbed. Something inside me whispered that I needed to check just for peace of mind. So that afternoon, when the sun was bright and the world felt harmless again, I decided to walk around the lake. The trail was thin but manageable. Quiet except for the crunch of leaves under my boots and the distant song of a bird hiding somewhere deeper in the trees. As I approached the other cabin, the air felt colder. The trees pressed closer together and the stillness grew thicker, as if the forest didn't want me there. The cabin itself looked more weathered than I expected, dusty windows, peeling paint, vines crawling up the sides. The porch sagged slightly under the weight of age. But the light inside was as bright as ever, glowing against everything else that seemed untouched for years. I stepped onto the porch, expecting the light to flicker or shift, but it didn't. It stayed perfectly steady. When I peered through the window, the interior looked empty, no furniture, no personal belongings, just an open room, and that made no sense. The packing I'd seen nights before should have revealed something, but the room had nothing in it, not even dust motes moved in the light. And the lamp that should have been casting the glow wasn't visible anywhere. My breath felt lodged in my throat as I tried the door. It creaked softly open. The air inside was cold, stale, untouched. The floor had a thin layer of dust that wasn't disturbed by footprints, not mine, not anyone's. It was as if the cabin had been abandoned for years, yet there was light. A bright, steady glow that felt like it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stepped inside carefully, my boots leaving clear prints. That's when I saw the footprints. Not mine, not old, fresh. They began in the center of the room, facing the wall to the left. Bare footprints, long and narrow, pressed deeply into the dust. They led toward a corner, circled once, then stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them simply vanished mid-step. A faint cold brushed the back of my neck. I turned to leave, but the doorway was dimmer now. The light behind me seemed to pulse once, like a slow heartbeat. When I glanced back at the window, the glow had softened into a darker amber, almost red around the edges. For the first time since arriving, I felt genuine fear, quiet, heavy, inescapable. I stepped out of the cabin, closing the door behind me. The light flickered sharply, once, twice, then steadied again. I didn't look back as I walked around the lake, every hair on my arms raised, every crunch of leaves sounding too loud in the forest stillness. That night, the light across the water didn't just glow, it throbbed, slow, rhythmic, like it was breathing, and the packing returned. But this time it was closer to the window. Each step revealed more of the outline, a long figure, slender, turning its head slightly as if listening. I left at sunrise, packed my things in silence and drove away without making breakfast. When I reached home late that evening, I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. As I walked into my apartment, something caught my eye outside my second-floor window, one I always kept shielded by curtains. A faint, steady glow from the abandoned building across the street. As amber unmoving. And as I stood there frozen, I saw the silhouette pass slowly across the light. Just once, slow, like it had followed me home. I stayed at the cabin because it seemed like the perfect halfway point between a weekend escape and a reset from my normal routine. A close friend had invited a small group of us for a quiet retreat, nothing intense, just a few days of hiking, cooking together, and sitting around a fire without the constant pull of our phones. The place was old but cared for, sitting at the base of a wooded slope where the air always smelled a little damp, like pine needles and cold soil. Inside, the cabin was warm and dim, lit mostly by yellow lamps that hummed quietly in the corners. When I first walked through it, I remember thinking how still it felt, like the walls were holding their breath. Everything seemed peaceful except for one detail, a bedroom door at the back of the hallway that was locked with a rusted latch, the kind that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. At first, it didn't bother me. Older cabins always have strange layout choices, storage closets, sealed rooms, spaces owners never finished renovating. But the lock on that door struck me as unusually old. The metal had a greenish tinge, corroded in a way that suggested it didn't belong to this century. The wood around the latch was darker too, worn down like someone had gripped it often, maybe too often. I didn't mention it to anyone. It felt like the kind of detail you learn to ignore in places like that. But that night, when the rest of the cabin settled into sleep around me, I kept thinking about it. In a space that small, something sealed off becomes hard not to notice. The first irregularity happened late, long after everyone else had gone to bed. I was brushing my teeth in the narrow bathroom when I felt a faint draft on the back of my legs. It wasn't cold, just a gentle movement of air that didn't fit the stillness of the night. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw it immediately. The locked door wasn't fully closed. It wasn't open enough to see inside, just a thin sliver, barely noticeable, but enough to send a quiet ripple of unease through me. As I stood there for a moment, listening, The cabin was silent except for the faint ticking of cooling pipes. I nudged the door gently with my fingertip. It didn't move. It felt solid, locked, unmoving. And yet that thin gap remained, almost like the door had shifted on its own. The next morning, the door looked completely normal again, shut tightly, latch still locked, no trace of the gap I'd seen. I mentioned it casually over breakfast, half joking, but my friend shrugged it off. "It's warped," he said. "Old wood does that when the humidity changes." He sounded confident enough, and I didn't push it, but the explanation felt thin once I remembered how steady the door had felt under my hand. Still, with sunlight spilling into the cabin and everyone laughing about something, the memory softened into something I could almost rationalize. Well, the second night changed everything. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint clicking sound. At first, I thought it was something outside, a branch tapping the siding or an animal brushing against the cabin. But as I became fully awake, I realized the sound was coming from inside. A soft, rhythmic click like metal touching metal. I lay still, focusing on the direction. It was coming from the hallway, more specifically from the locked door. Each click sounded intentional, spaced just far enough apart that it felt like someone testing the latch quietly, carefully. I sat up slowly, my heart picking up speed. I listened for movement from the others, but the cabin stayed silent. After a minute, the clicking stopped. The absence of the sound somehow felt louder than the noise itself. A curiosity mixed with fear pulled me out of bed. I stepped into the hallway, the wood floor cold under my feet. The door at the back was closed, but something about it felt different. The air around it was colder, and as I moved closer, I felt a faint breath of air pushing against my legs again, like the draft I felt the first night. I crouched slightly and could see a faint line of darkness under the door, as if the room behind it was absorbing light rather than lacking it. I waited there, staring, until a soft sound came from the other side. A slow, deliberate shuffle, the weight of something moving gently across the floor. I froze, breath held, every instinct telling me to back away. But the sound faded as quickly as it came, replaced by silence so complete it felt unnatural. The next morning, I checked the door again. The latch was locked firmly in place, cold to the touch. But the dust around the bottom edge was disturbed, a faint trail of broken particles leading outward like something had brushed against it from inside. I didn't say anything this time, trying to explain that would only make me sound paranoid. The daylight felt thin that morning, weak in a way I hadn't noticed before. And every time I passed the hallway, I avoided looking at the door, not wanting to see another shift in its position. On the third night, I couldn't fall asleep at all. I lay awake listening to the forest outside, the occasional creak in the cabin, the soft snoring from the room beside mine. When the brushing sound started again, it caught me completely off guard. Not the clicking this time, not packing, just a soft, continuous movement, like something was pressing both palms against the inside of the door and dragging them down. Slow, careful, testing the wood. My body stiffened instantly. I didn't even dare to breathe loudly. The sound paused, then continued, this time with a faint thump, like a forehead resting heavily against the door after too long of lining. I wasn't imagining it. The sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was on the other side. For an agonizing minute, the sound continued. Then everything stopped so abruptly that the silence rang in my ears. A few seconds passed, then the latch clicked, once softly, like a finger tracing it. Another click followed, then another, not trying to unlock it, just feeling it, mapping its shape. I stayed frozen until morning light seeped through the curtains. On the last day, we decided to cut the trip short. Everyone blamed the weather, the heavy clouds gathering over the ridge, the drop in temperature. but I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin itself had grown heavier with each passing night. Before we left, I lingered in the hallway for a moment, staring at the locked door. The air around it felt cold again, colder than the rest of the house. And for the first time since arriving, I noticed something I'd missed, a faint outline of fingerprints on the lower panel of the door smudged into the grain of the wood. Not adult-sized, smaller, much smaller, and close to the floor. I backed away quickly and didn't look again. So a week after returning home, I woke up one night to a familiar sound, a soft, deliberate clicking. It took only a moment to realize it was coming from the hallway, from the closet door near my bedroom, the same slow, testing sound of metal being brushed by fingertips. And in the faint silence that followed, I felt a draft of cold air slip under the door. I went to the cabin because I needed to finish a writing project that had been dragging on for months. I imagined quiet mornings, long afternoons with coffee, and nights where the only sound was the lake tapping gently against the dock outside. The cabin itself sat at the edge of a thick stretch of woods, a little too old and a little too forgotten, but it felt safe enough. When I first walked in, the dusty light filtering through the blinds made everything seem softer, like the whole place was settling into its own silence. By the time night came around, the air had cooled, the refrigerator hummed in the corner, and the world outside felt still in that comforting, lonely way you only get in deep woods. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I certainly wasn't expecting someone to knock on the door at 2:13 a.m. the first night I arrived. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft taps, polite, almost gentle. The kind of knock someone uses when they're afraid of disturbing a sleeping household. The sound woke me instantly, not in panic, but in confusion. There was no reason for anyone to be out there in the middle of the night. I listened for footsteps, a voice, anything, but the cabin stayed silent. After a minute, I slipped out of bed and crept toward the front door, my socks barely whispering against the wooden floor. I didn't open it. I didn't even look through the peephole. I just stood there and waited, noticing how cold the air was around the doorframe and how still the night felt beyond it. After a few seconds, I told myself it had to be a branch, maybe an animal brushing against the wood. But animals don't knock, and branches don't tap in perfect rhythm. The next morning, I checked for footprints or any signs someone had been there. Nothing. The dirt outside was untouched, the small welcome mat undisturbed, even the dew on the railing remained unbroken. It made me feel a bit foolish for how long I'd stood in the hallway the night before, holding my breath like a child scared of a shadow. The rest of the day was calm, almost peaceful. I wrote for hours, sat by the lake, made dinner while listening to the radio through static. For a while, the previous night felt distant, like a half-dream I'd exaggerated in my head. But when I went to bed again, I found myself glancing toward the front door, watching the shadows near it stretch and shift as the cabin settled. At 2:13 a.m., the knocking returned. 3 taps, soft, even, and this time it was followed by a faint shift of weight on the porch, like someone was standing on the other side, leaning forward. My throat tightened as I lay frozen in bed, waiting for another knock that never came. I felt the urge to get up, to look through the peephole, but something inside me resisted. It was a strange, instinctive pull, like I already knew I shouldn't see what was waiting there. I listened for footsteps moving away, but nothing happened. The presence lingered in a way I could feel more than hear, like an awareness directed toward me through the thin wood of the cabin door. I didn't sleep again until the sky began to lighten, when birdsong finally broke the heaviness. The next morning, again, there were no footprints. By the third night, I found myself dreading the quiet. Around 2 a.m., the cabin seemed to breathe with me, every creak amplified, every shift in the wind carrying weight. I kept the lights dim, sitting on the couch with a blanket around my shoulders, trying not to watch the clock but always aware of the time. When 2:13 approached, my chest tightened with a quiet sense of inevitability. And right on time, 3 taps, gentle and patient. But this time I heard something else afterward. A long, slow exhale. The unmistakable sound of someone breathing just inches away, separated from me only by wood and darkness. My skin prickled as the breath grew slightly louder, more deliberate. I forced myself to stand up, though my legs felt heavy, and crept toward the door. I didn't open it, but I did look through the peephole. The porch was empty, completely empty. No figure, no shadow, no movement, just the dark outline of trees beyond the railing. But even as I stared out into nothing, I could still hear breathing right next to the door, not in front of it, off to the side. As if whoever was there knew exactly where the peephole was and had stepped out of view. I backed away slowly until the sound faded. By the fourth night, I considered leaving, but part of me felt ridiculous packing up early because of a few soft knocks. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, sleep deprivation, the isolation playing tricks. Yet when darkness settled again, the fear returned, familiar and suffocating. I didn't go to bed. I didn't even sit. I just stood in the center of the cabin waiting, counting the seconds as the clock ticked. When 2:13 came, the knocking arrived again. But this time there were 4 knocks, slow, heavy, each one making the frame tremble slightly. So something had changed. The quiet afterward felt charged, like the air had thickened. Then came a faint scraping sound, as if fingers were dragging slowly along the doorframe, testing it, feeling the edges. I covered my mouth instinctively, afraid my breathing would give me away, even though I knew it didn't matter. Whatever was out there already knew I was inside. The scraping lasted a long time, slow and deliberate, until it suddenly stopped. Then came one more soft knock, closer and somehow more intimate than the others. Almost like someone placing their knuckles gently against the wood in a silent greeting. The next morning I found something new, a handprint on the porch railing. Not large, not small, just wrong somehow. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow, and the angle of the print suggested the hand had been placed there not to balance but to lean in. As if someone had positioned themselves close to the door, listening carefully. That was the day I decided to leave, but the weather had other plans. A sudden storm rolled in, dropping heavy rain and wind that made the trees groan. Driving out on the narrow dirt road would be dangerous, maybe impossible. So I stayed one last night, though something deep in my chest screamed not to. I barricaded the door with a chair, a stack of books, anything I could find. I left every light on. The storm outside roared, wind slamming against the windows, rain hammering the roof. For a brief moment, I almost believed the noise would drown out everything else. But when the clock hit 2:13, the cabin went completely silent, as if the storm outside had paused. Then the knocking came. Not soft this time, not polite. 3 hard blows that shook the door, making the chair rattle. I stumbled backward, heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear. Another set of knocks came faster, more urgent. The chair shifted an inch across the floor. Then the scraping returned, frantic and insistent, tracing the outline of the door. I heard breathing again, but this time it was heavier, almost desperate. The knocking stopped abruptly, followed by a slow creak of weight pressing against the wood. Then came a whisper. Not words, just a sound, a low vibration that felt like it came from the walls themselves. I didn't sleep. I sat awake until the storm finally faded and a pale light crept through the windows. By mid-morning, the road had cleared enough for me to leave. I didn't look back at the cabin as I drove away, not until I reached the main road. When I did, I saw the porch. The railing was wet from the rains. But the handprint was still there. I moved cities after that, traded forests for apartment buildings and streetlights that stay bright all night. For a long time, I didn't hear anything unusual. I told myself the knocking had been some strange nightmare shaped by isolation. Then one night, months later, I woke up with a strange feeling, an old, familiar tension crawling up my spine. I lay still in bed, listening to the hum of the heater, the dull whir of passing cars. And then, from the other side of my apartment door, came three soft knocks. At 2:13 a.m. A perfect rhythm. A patient. Like whoever it was had finally found me again. Night has a way of reshaping the world, especially in places where the trees stand close and the darkness feels deeper than it should. These cabin stories remind us that silence can hold its own kind of presence, and that the things we brush off in daylight, creaks in the floorboards, a door that shifts slightly, a light that shouldn't be on, take on a different meaning when the world grows still. Fear doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it steps into the room quietly, the way the woods do after sunset. If any part of these stories lingered with you, know that it's a feeling many people share. There's something universal about those moments when the night feels too attentive, when every sound seems to pause just long enough to make you wonder if you're being listened to. We tell these stories not to chase sleep away, but to offer company in the hours when your mind wanders to places it normally avoids. You're not alone in that strange space between comfort and unease. If you'd like to return for more nights like this, you're welcome to stay close to the channel. Subscribing or sharing these stories helps them reach others who sit awake at the edge of the dark, listening for things they hope not to hear. There will always be more whispered accounts, more quiet truths told in the late hours. For now, let the night settle gently around you. Let the last echoes of these woods fade from your thoughts, even if just for a moment. And if your home creaks a little or the shadows lean in oddly, try not to think too hard about it. Sometimes the darkness is just darkness, and sometimes it remembers who listens. Rest well if you can.